Welcome to Nightfall North. There is no need to stay awake for this. Settle wherever you are, let your shoulders come down from your ears, and let the room grow dim and unimportant around you. Tonight we are going to spend the whole night in one city, a rainy city on the west coast of Norway, held in a ring of mountains with a harbor at its heart. Parts of its story are dark, as the stories on this channel tend to be, and I will carry the dark parts gently. There is no hurry in any of it. We have all night, and the city has 1,000 years. Begin with the rain, because everything in this story happens under it. Bergen is one of the rainiest cities in Europe. The weather comes in off the North Atlantic, heavy with water, and meets a wall of mountains, and the mountains make it stop and empty itself. Rain on more than 200 days in a year. Not dramatic rain, most of the time, a soft, patient, gray-green rain that beads on wool and drips from eaves and makes the cobbles shine. People there have never really minded. You dress for it, you walk through it, and after a while, the sound of it on a roof becomes something close to silence. Now look down through that rain from the ridge of the mountains and see why the city exists at all. Between the peaks there is a sheltered arm of the sea, a bay called Vågen, reaching in from the coast like a hand opened flat. The ocean outside is restless and dangerous. The bay inside is calm. Any sailor working this coast 1,000 years ago knew the place, because it was where you could bring a loaded boat in through the weather and let it lie still. People traded on that shore long before anyone called it a town. Boats drawn up on the stones, hides and dried fish in iron changing hands, fires on the beach at evening. The land around the bay was soft and green, good grazing, mild for Norway, kept gentle by the same sea air that brought the rain. Then somewhere around the year 1070, a king decided the place should be more than a beach. His name was Olav Kyrre, Olav the Quiet, they called him, because he reigned for a generation and kept the peace for nearly all of it, which was rare enough in those centuries to earn a man a name. Tradition says he founded the town, gave it standing, gave it churches. The name it carried was Bjørgvin, the green meadow among the mountains. Say it slowly and you can see it. Grass running down to still water, mountains all around like the walls of a room, and the gray sky for a ceiling. And the town grew because it stood at the meeting point of two hungers. Far to the north of Bergen, off the Lofoten Islands, the winter sea filled every year with cod, more fish than the north could ever eat. Hung on wooden racks in the cold wind, the fish dried hard as board and light as bread, and it would keep for years. Stockfish it was called, and a boat could carry a fortune of it. Europe to the south was full of people, full of fast days, full of mouths, and short of food that could travel. The fish came south along the coast, and Bergen was where the north's fish met the south's grain and cloth and silver, in the calm water between the mountains. So the beach became a row of boathouses, and the boathouses became warehouses, and the warehouses became long rows of wooden buildings standing shoulder to shoulder along the eastern shore of the bay, gable after gable after gable, with the rain running off their roofs into the harbor. Seen from the water, the town looked like a single long timber wall with 100 doors. The town grew, and the king's men grew with it. By the 1200s, Bergen was the largest town in Norway, the largest town, in fact, in all the Nordic countries. Kings were crowned there, kings were buried there. For a long stretch of that century it was, in everything but the word, the capital of the kingdom, and the king who made it so was Håkon, who had begun life as a hunted child in a civil war and ended it as the ruler of a Norway stretching from Greenland to the Scottish Isles. A king like that needed a hall that said what he was. So on the headland guarding the harbor mouth, beside the cathedral, his masons raised a great ceremonial hall of pale stone in a town where nearly everything else was wood. It took years. It was finished around 1261 in time for the wedding of his son, and for 1 week that summer the hall held nearly 2,000 guests, and the green meadow among the mountains was, briefly, the center of the northern world. The hall still stands today. Håkon's Hall it is called. Hold on to it, we will see it again, near the end of tonight's story, on the worst morning of its long life. But this chapter is not really about the hall. It is about a girl, and then about a woman, and about the strange, dark thing a grieving town can do. The girl was called Margaret. She was the granddaughter of the Norwegian king, and through her mother she was also heir to the crown of Scotland, a 3-year-old girl living in Bergen who was proclaimed Queen of Scots across the sea. When she was 7, in the year 1290, they put her on a ship to go and claim her kingdom. She never arrived. Somewhere near Orkney the child sickened and died at sea, and the ship turned back, and her father the king met the coffin and looked at his daughter's face and buried her in the cathedral in Bergen beside her mother. Scotland fell into the wars of succession. Norway kept its grief. 10 years passed, the king died, his brother wore the crown. And then in the year 1300, a ship came into Bergen from Lübeck in Germany, and a woman stepped ashore and said, "I am Margaret. I did not die. I was betrayed and sold and carried off to foreign lands, and I have come home for what is mine." It could not be true. The real Margaret would have been 17 years old that autumn. This woman's hair was streaked with gray. Those who saw her guessed she was around 40. Her own father had looked into the coffin, and yet Bergen believed her. Ordinary people believed her, and some of the clergy believed her, and the belief spread through the wet streets like a slow fire, because a story in which the child had lived was so much better than the story they had. The new king could not allow it. A false heir is treason, whatever the streets believe. In the year 1301, on the bare headland called Nordnes on the western side of the harbor, the woman who called herself Margaret was burned at the stake. Her husband was beheaded. And then something happened that the king had not ordered and could not stop. The people of Bergen began to walk out to Nordnes quietly in ones and twos in the rain to the place where she had died. They lit candles, they prayed. A cult grew at the execution ground, tended by people who had decided against every fact that the fire had taken their true princess. It lasted for years. The town kept its candles, and the sea, out beyond the headland, kept its own council. It was from that sea in the late summer of 1349 that a ship came in from England. There was nothing unusual in that. English ships came to Bergen all the time. It was the busiest harbor in the north, and grain and cloth came in as fish went out, season after season, as regular as weather. The ship moored, the cargo came ashore. Men carried sacks across wet planking into the warehouses, the way men had for 200 years. Then the crew began to die. Within days, the men of that ship were dead, and then people who had worked the cargo began to die, and then people who had only lived near them. 2 Icelandic bishops happened to be in Norway that year, and the annals written from their accounts say it plainly, in the flat voice of people describing something too large for ornament. The plague came to Bergen on a ship from England, and from Bergen it went out over all of Norway. You have heard of this sickness. The Black Death had been moving across Europe for 2 years by then, out of the east, through Italy, through France, through England, and everywhere it went it did the same arithmetic. Bergen was where it stepped ashore in Norway. The town that existed because everything passed through it now learned what that meant. The fish went out, the grain came in, and the plague traveled with them, along every route the trade had built. By the autumn it had reached Trondheim, far to the north. By the following year there was hardly a valley in the country it had missed. I will not walk you through the sickness itself. It was quick and it was cruel, and the people of that century met it with what they had: prayer, herbs, courage, and burial. What is worth sitting with in the dark is the quietness of the numbers. In some parts of Norway, perhaps a third of all the people died in those first 2 years. Counting the waves of plague that returned in the decades after, historians believe the country lost more than half its people within a generation. The estimates vary. From this distance they can only vary, but every version of the count describes the same thing. A country emptied the way a tide goes out. In Bergen the church bells rang for the dead until, in the hardest weeks, the story goes, there were too few left to ring them and too many to ring them for. Farms in the valleys stood empty with the doors open. Whole parishes vanished from the records, and some of their names were only found again centuries later, when someone's plow turned up a churchyard where the maps showed forest. The town by the bay survived, reduced, hollowed, but alive. Towns like Bergen always survived in the end because the thing that made them exist had not died. The cod still came in from the winter sea, in numbers beyond imagining, exactly as before. The racks still stood in the northern wind. Hungry Europe was still hungry, more so now, with its own fields untended. And so in the years after the Great Dying, if you had stood on the shore of the bay between the mountains, you would have seen the strangest, most stubborn sight in this whole story. Sails coming in past the headland, trade resuming. Life in its patched clothes, going back to work along the harbor between the half-empty lanes and the shuttered houses. But the town that went back to work was weaker than it had been, and it was about to have a very long visit. The men who came for the fish, in the decades that followed, spoke German. They came from the trading cities of the German coast, Lübeck, Hamburg, Bremen, cities bound together in a league of merchants called the Hansa, which owned no kingdom and commanded no army, and yet moved more wealth than most kings ever saw. The Hansa dealt in whatever the north could yield, and what Norway yielded was fish. Around 1360, in the weakened decades after the plague, the League established one of its great foreign stations in Bergen, a kontor they called it, a counting house the size of a district. It took over the long rows of wooden trading houses on the eastern shore of the bay. The neighborhood is called Bryggen, the wharf, and the Germans would hold it for 400 years. Understand what a strange thing now stood beside the harbor. Briggen became a town within the town, German-speaking, governed by its own rules, answering to Lübeck rather than to any Norwegian. No women were permitted to live within it. The merchants and their people, 1,000 men and more in the busy years, lived where they worked in the tall, narrow, gabled houses, 2 rooms deep and many rooms high, packed with stockfish and grain in barrels, joined by dark passageways where the daylight only fell in strips. And here is the detail I want you to keep, because it is the detail everything else in this chapter hangs from. In those houses, fire was forbidden. Not carelessness with fire, fire itself. No hearth, no stove, no candle flame among the goods. The League had watched wooden trading towns burn to the waterline often enough to write its harshest rule about it, and the rule was kept for 4 centuries. Think about what that means on the west coast of Norway. The rain outside, the sea wind funneling up the passageways, the winter darkness 16, 17 hours deep, and inside, in the finest merchant houses of the kingdom, no fire. Men wrote their ledgers in fingerless gloves by the gray light of a window, their breath standing in the air above the page. They slept in cupboard beds, 2 to bed for warmth, in rooms where the water froze in the jug. Some of the wealthiest men in northern Europe spent their working lives colder than the fishermen they bought from 400 winters, without a fire. There was one warmth allowed, and only one. Set back behind the rows, away from the goods, each merchant community kept a common hall, the assembly rooms, built to be as fireproof as the age knew how. There, and only there, food was cooked and a great hearth was lit, and in the evenings the men of each house gathered in the one warm room their world contained, to eat together under its low beams while the rain worked on the roof. It was a hard world, and it was hardest for the youngest. Boys came to Briggen at 14 or 15, many of them German, some Norwegian, bound to serve 6 years before they could call themselves journeymen of the trade. They hauled fish and scrubbed planking and froze in the warehouses, at the bottom of a society of men with no mothers in it, and the old accounts of Briggen tell of initiation rites for the new boys that were rough even by the standards of a rough age. Those who endured learned the trade of the North better than anyone alive, the grading of a dried cod by its sound and its color, the worth of a cargo at a glance. Season after season, century after century, the fish came down from Lofoten and the silver flowed back, through cold hands, in the forbidden absence of fire. But a town built of tar and timber, lit by open flame everywhere the rule did not reach, knows how its story goes. Bergen burned, it burned the way other cities flooded or froze, as a thing that came with the place, that every generation met at least once, that the town absorbed into its idea of itself. The sagas and the town records keep the count like tide marks, great fires in the age of the kings, fires in the 1400s, the 1500s, the 1600s. A city of tarred wood packed gable to gable around a harbor, heated and lit by open flame, in a country where the winter nights are long, the mathematics only ever pointed one way. The rain, for all its patience, could not be everywhere. People lived with it the way coastal people live with the sea. Every house kept its leather fire bucket. Watchmen walked the lanes at night, and the church towers kept bells that meant, when they rang in a certain way at a certain hour, one thing only. Everyone in Bergen all their lives knew what that sound meant and what to do when it came. Take the children, take the strongbox, get to the water. And then came the one the city would measure all the others against. It began on the 19th of May, 1702, late spring, when the timber had dried after winter. What started as one house's misfortune found the wind, and the wind carried it, and by the time it was done, 9/10 of Bergen was gone, 90 houses in 100. The churches, the merchant houses, the records, the roofs over nearly every head in the largest city in Norway, a town 7 centuries old, reduced in a day and a night to a field of smoking beams running down to the harbor, where the ships had stood off into the bay to watch their city go. Try gently to stand in the morning after. Rain on ash, that smell held in the air for weeks. Chimneys of brick standing alone like grave markers because brick does not burn. Here and there strange survivals, the kind fires always leave. A stone cellar with its goods intact, an iron church bell lying in the ruin of its tower, one lane of houses spared by a shift of the wind, its windows looking out on the end of the world. And then, and this is the part of the story that tells you what kind of city this was, they built it again. Not somewhere safer, not to some new and prudent plan. They built it where it had stood on the same plots, along the same lanes, because the bay was still the bay, and the fish still had to land where the water lay calm, and a man's burnt plot by the harbor was still worth more than safe ground anywhere else. Bergen rose again as it had risen after every fire before. The same long rows, the same narrow passageways, the same tall gables in fresh pale timber, built by men who fully understood that what they were building would one day burn and who built it anyway. Much of what a visitor sees at Bergen today is that rebuilding, the shape of the medieval wharf, carried through the fire of 1702 like a memory the city refused to put down. The city, in other words, could be rebuilt, and always was. Fire took the roofs and the walls and the goods, and grief enough, but timber can be cut again, and Bergen had 1,000 years of practice. Not everything that came to Bergen could be rebuilt. On the landward edge of the old town, away from the harbor noise, there stood, and stands today, a small huddle of wooden buildings around a courtyard and a modest church. It is a quiet place now, with grass in the yard and rain on the shingles. It was a quiet place then too, but it was a different kind of quiet. This was St. George's Hospital, and for 500 years it housed the people of Western Norway who had leprosy. The hospital is older than almost anything around it. It appears in the records early in the 1400s, and it had likely stood for some time before that. It burned with the city in 1702 and was rebuilt like everything else, and it went on. Generation after generation, the sick came in from the fjord districts, rowed in by their families, walking with a stick, carried to live out their lives inside that courtyard, in small rooms off long corridors, within the sound of their own church bell. Leprosy is one of humanity's oldest recorded diseases, and for most of history one of its most feared, not because it killed quickly, but because it did not. It moved slowly over years, taking feeling from the hands and feet, changing the face, and the fear of it ran so deep that in much of Europe the sick were declared dead in law while still alive. What nobody knew, not for thousands of years, was what caused it. A curse, said some ages. A punishment, bad blood, bad air, and inheritance. The one thing everyone knew was that no one came back from it. Here is the turn in the story. In the 1800s, while leprosy faded from most of Europe, it clung on stubbornly along the Norwegian coast, and Bergen, the city where the coast came to town, became its center. Between 1850 and 1900, this one rainy city held 3 leprosy hospitals and the largest concentration of patients anywhere in Europe. And because the sick were here, something else gathered here too: doctors, registers. Careful records of every patient in the country, one of the first national disease registries on Earth. If the old riddle was ever going to be answered, it would be answered in Bergen. It was, in 1873, a young Bergen physician named Gerhard Armor Hansen, working with the patients of this city, looked down his microscope at material from the sick and found, in a time when the idea was still radical, the true cause: a bacterium. Rod-shaped, slow, unmistakable. Not a curse, not a bloodline, not a judgment, a germ, one of the first ever proven to cause a human disease. It was a finding that reordered medicine's whole understanding of contagion, and it came not from the great capitals, but from a hospital courtyard in the rain, in a town that had spent its history taking in what the sea brought. The disease the world had called leprosy has carried his name ever since: Hansen's disease. It is curable now, has been for decades, and the patient registers of Bergen, the ledgers of all those quiet lives, are preserved today in the archives that the world has listed as part of the memory of mankind. St. George's received its last 2 patients into old age. When they died in the 1940s, 5 centuries of the hospital's work ended. The courtyard kept its grass and its church and its silence, a garden quiet now, with the healthy city humming faintly beyond the fence. The new century came to Bergen the way it came everywhere, with engines. Steamships in the bay, a railway through the mountains, telephone wires over the old lanes. The city grew out along the fjord in both directions, and the 20th century seemed for a while to be treating Bergen kindly. Then came April 1940 and the war and the occupation of Norway. For 4 years Bergen lived as an occupied port city. Soldiers in the streets, ships of a foreign navy in the harbor, the war mostly elsewhere but never far. What happened next is not a battle story. It is an accident story, one of the largest of the war in Norway, and it begins with engine trouble. In April 1944, a Dutch cargo steamer requisitioned into German service was working its way up the Norwegian coast, headed for the far north. Her name was Vorbod. Her engines were failing, and she put into Bergen for repairs. In her holds, she carried around 120 tons of explosives. Every rule that existed said such a ship must not lie in the middle of a city. She was to anchor far out at a safe roadstead and wait. Instead, through some chain of wartime carelessness that an inquiry would later trace step by step, Vorbode was brought all the way in to the quay at the foot of the old fortress, below the stone walls of Håkon's hall itself, a few hundred meters of open water from the wooden gables of Bergen. She lay there overnight, an ordinary rusty steamer among the harbor traffic, while the city slept around her. At 21 minutes to 9 the next morning, the 20th of April, 1944, the cargo ignited. The ship simply ceased to exist. The blast flattened the harbor district around the fortress, threw a wave across the bay that struck the far shore like a second blow, and was felt, the accounts say, along the coast for many miles. The ship's anchor, tons of iron, was found high on the mountainside above the town. Around the harbor, whole neighborhoods of wooden houses were crushed, and then within the hour began to burn the old Bergen story, arriving now by a new door. When the counting was done, 158 people were dead, close to 5,000 were injured, and some 5,000 more had lost their homes. It was the worst single morning in the city's modern history. Because it happened on that particular date, the birthday of the German dictator, the first assumption on every side was sabotage, and the resistance was suspected at once. The occupiers investigated, and the conclusion, confirmed again after the war, was quieter and stranger. No plot, no fuse, no hero or villain at all. The cargo had ignited on its own. Unstable explosives, badly stowed in a ship that should never have been there. An accident with a city standing next to it. And the old stone hall, Håkon's Hall, 7 centuries old, stood closest of all the city's ancient buildings to the blast. The explosion tore off its roof and gutted it with fire. The medieval tower beside it was wrecked almost as badly. But the walls, the pale stone walls raised for a royal wedding in 1261, stood. Blackened, roofless, open to the rain, they stood above the smoke of the ruined harbor as they had stood above everything else. The false Margaret's pyre across the water, the plague ship, the fire of 1702. In the years after the war, the hall and the tower were restored patiently, stone by stone, and they stand whole today. Stone remembers by standing. Wood remembers too, in its own way, and the proof of that came 11 years later from underneath the city's feet. In 1955, Bergen burned again. After everything, the medieval fires, 1702, the explosion of 44, the old wharf's own story found it one more time, and about half of the ancient rows went down in a night. The city had seen it before. The fire buckets had become fire engines, but the grief was the old grief. When it was over, there lay by the harbor a broad black field of ash where some of the oldest standing wood in Norway had been. And then something unexpected happened. Beneath the burned buildings, beneath their floors, packed down into the wet dark ground, lay the older city. Every fire in Bergen's 1,000 years had ended the same way. Level the ash, lay new timber over it, build again. Layer upon layer, a meter and more of them, pressed down and sealed from the air by the eternal rain, and things that are kept wet and dark do not rot. Where the fire of 55 had cleared the ground, archaeologists came, and they stayed for 13 years. What they brought up out of that ground was the everyday world of medieval Bergen, preserved as if the centuries were weather that had passed over it. Shoes worn to the shape of their owner's feet, combs, ship's rope, children's toy boats, and this is the treasure, wood that spoke. Some 670 sticks and scraps of wood carved with runes, not the solemn stone inscriptions of monuments, but notes, messages, the pockets and margins of a living town, 700 years old. Before Bergen, many scholars believed runes had been reserved for the grand and the sacred. What came out of the Bergen mud ended that idea in the gentlest possible way. A wooden tag from a sack of goods, Eystein owns me. A stick passed from one hand to another with a merchant's plain instruction about cargo. A line of longing carved small, my love, kiss me, prayers, tally marks, a scrap of a drinking song. The ordinary voices of ordinary people, which history almost never keeps, kept here by fire and rain together, the two old enemies of this story, conspiring at last to save something. In one stick, catalog number B149 carries a message of 5 words. A man is somewhere he ought not to be, perhaps at his ale, perhaps only working late among the warehouses 700 years ago in the rain. And someone has sent a boy to find him and press this stick into his hand. It says, Jida tells you to go home. Across 7 centuries, past the plague and the Hansa and all the fires, that is what survives. Jida, whose supper is getting cold, telling him to come home. Historians have their treasures. I think this one belongs to everyone. The rows of Bergen that still stand were listed by the world, some decades ago, as heritage belonging to all of us, the shape of the medieval wharf, carried and recarried through every burning. The rain still falls, more than 200 days in the year. The bay still lies calm between the mountains, and the city still stands around it on top of all its older selves. The green meadow, the king's town, the plague harbor, the cold houses, the burned and rebuilt, the quiet hospital, the mended hall. 1,000 years, and the door to it all is still the same sheltered water that let the first boats in. Let the city keep the watch tonight, it has had the practice. Tonight's story was told with a synthetic voice and shaped with care from the real history of Bergen. Thank you for spending the night in the north with me. Go gently, and as Gita would say, go home and sleep. Good night.